Welcome back, everyone. Our last panel for today is a discussion around the film installation for director John Akomfrah titled Mimesis, African Soldier. I hope that all of you had a chance to see the film at the Hamriya Studios on the first day of the conference. It is still there, present, installed at the Hamriya Studios for the next week or so, if you didn't have a chance to see it. Unfortunately, the director, John Akomfrah, is not feeling very well and will not be able to join us for this discussion. But we have Professor Joseph Oduro Frimpong, director of the Center for African Popular Culture at Ashesi University, and Carina Ray, associate professor of African and African American Studies at Brandeis University, to talk about the film. I'd like to invite the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. As Satan said, John isn't with us right now, and we wish him speedy recovery. So what we thought we would do nonetheless is have a discussion. Frimpong and myself will share some initial thoughts and then really open it up for discussion. I don't think that it's possible to go into the installation and to watch this very powerful film and not come away with lots of questions and thoughts to be discussed. And so the one, I guess, silver lining is that hopefully in this conversation panel, we'll have the time and space for conversation that we wish we could have had for some of the other panels. Frimpong, would you like me to start off with a few observations, or would you like to?
Please go first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just a couple of things that I wanted to, as a historian, my inclination is to try and situate anything that I encounter in history. And so for me, one of the things that was really important to think about was where, in particular Ghana, where it fits into this story of World War I. And the power, in part, of John's film, as I mentioned yesterday in my opening remarks, is that he refuses to allow the over 6 million Africans and people who came from elsewhere from Europe's empires to be relegated to a footnote in the Eurocentric history of the telling of this war. And in fact, as far as Britain is concerned, the first shots that were fired in World War II were fired by members of the Gold Coast Regiment in August 1914 in a campaign in German Togoland, right? So even if we're thinking about, this as a quote-unquote European war, as far as Britain's role in it, it was taking place in West Africa, and the Gold Coast Regiment was at its center, was a kind of originary moment in that sense. But beyond kind of what might be dismissed as sort of anecdotal, it's quite clear that when you look at the history of what was then Gold Coast, that the war was quite a pivotal moment in the ways in which Gold Coasters were thinking about their place within the sort of the British Empire, but more broadly within the kind of world at large. And we have the conventional narrative that, when we think about the World War II and post-World War II period as the kind of moment of sort of the birth of these liberation movements of the formal anti-colonial movement. But, I would make the argument that actually we need to backdate that really to thinking about the centrality of World War I in that history. And I think that John's film really captures that in terms of being able to look at all of the variety of different emotions that Africans felt as a result of their participation in this war, and the variety of different kinds of experiences they had fighting in the war or otherwise being impacted by the war. And the beauty of this film is that it captures that. It doesn't confine it to a single story. It gives you a range the full range, the complex range of emotions from, what appears to almost sort of be joy in being able to take part in the war, to have a role in the war, to, being, very disturbed by their participation, being, sort of questioning what was happening, and all of these other emotions. And so when we think about World War I, it's also, I think, important to think that at that moment, it was a time when a lot of the arguments that nationalists were making in West Africa or in British West Africa were arguing for greater equality and parity within the British Empire, right? And if that was not to come, then calling for the dissolution of empire. And so I think when we situate it in that frame, it can help us to understand participation and what was at stake for many people in participating or otherwise supporting the war, right? It was predicated upon certain kinds of demand for greater inclusion and equality within the imperial sphere. And then, as I said, if that was not to come, then calling for the dissolution of it. And I think that kind of helps us to try to complexify why people served. And, one can call upon this, the history of conscription, which is obviously there, but then one also has to wrestle with those who were willing to serve. And just the last thing that I would say in kind of a historical context that can help you begin to see the complexities. If you look at, for instance, the nationalist press in the Gold Coast at that time, the Gold Coast Leader, the most sort of anti-colonial paper at the time, you were far more likely to see Gold Coast nationalists writing about the atrocities that were happening at the hands of Germans than you were to hear them sort of critiquing the British. And so you get a sense, again, of in that moment of the war, that these imperial loyalties were also being forged, as was this sort of nascent discontent, this growing discontent with colonial rule. And just switching over as a viewer, I just wanted to say, when I knew we were going to be able to watch this film, I wanted to watch it ahead of time, and I asked Salah, I said, can't they just send us a link, and can't I just watch it on the, on my computer ahead of time so I can prepare? And he said, no, you have to watch it as an installation. It has to be specially, screened on 3 different films, and I really just didn't get it. And then, of course, when I sat down, I fully understood, right? The saturation of the stimulation of trying to kind of contend with these 3 different screens and the different sounds and the images and the intensity of light and motion moving on and off of these 3 different screens, and the way in which it was kind of so overwhelming. And for me, it was really John's powerful way of making you understand what these, almost exclusively, but not all, men were feeling, like what the kind of ways in which they were overwhelmed by all of this sort of stimulation and the violence and the movement, and that really came forward for me as I was contending with these 3 different screens. So that resolved the question for me of why I couldn't just watch it on my computer screen.
Yeah, and going off of that, of course, I did not know what I was going to get out of that movie, out of that film. And what was clear to me after watching it was, of course, John's interest in the historical record as a way to counterbalance, the selective amnesia, right, that is in what can be called, World War I history. And in watching the movie as, a visual studies scholar, what was striking for me was, John's unique way of using noise, right, as a way of knowing. And of course, initially I was baffled, right, because you are kind of hit with all these different noises. But then at the end of the movie and reflecting on the movie, what became clear was that John was using noise in a very unique way to enhance the type of narrative that he wants to tell. And that narrative was obviously to highlight, the role of, black and brown bodies, right, in this film. And in order to do that, powerfully, he used noise, the stream, the sound of the steam engine, for example, even, like the artillery shells and all that comes together to powerfully portray the idea that, black and brown bodies contributed equally in this, narrative that has been kind of taken out of what we know. So for me, that was really powerful, the focus on noise as a way of complementing his message, which I think he did very skillfully. Mm-hmm.
Just picking up on what you noted the presence of both black and brown soldiers in this film, and of course it's titled Mimesis, African Soldier, and so I was thinking a lot about that, right? That there's a clear intent to portray not just African soldiers, but soldiers from India and elsewhere, in the British Empire that were drawn into this war. And so if John was here, I would have asked him a question about the choice of the title. And for me, what I thought maybe was going on was, thinking about John and, sort of being sort of also steeped in Black British culture, and that moment when, in Britain at least, Black was a much broader category of being. It encompassed what we would call brown people today, but it also could encompass Irish people who were fighting for their independence as well. And so I kind of wondered if there was almost some kind of that spirit anyways was embedded in the title that he chose. And there's this one image that kept coming back, and he shows it a couple times, and it comes back at the end of the film. And it also made me sort of think about the ways in which he is both representing these multiple histories that are at play here, the different populations that were being drawn into this war, but also trying to blur the lines. So it's an image of three men. Two are dressed in uniform, and one is in a suit. I don't know if you all recall that image. And one, sort of if you're looking closely, looks like he may have been from India. The other one from somewhere in Africa. And then the figure that's in the suit is kind of racially ambiguous. And so for me, again, if he was here, I would have asked this question of, I would want to know who those figures were in that image, and whether or not that was some way of kind of giving us a message about both the kind of the diversity of different people, and then the kind of common shared set of experiences that people had. And I think that was some of the footage too, where you saw these very sort of multiracial groups of men together, I thought was also very powerful. And thinking about what was, we know that there was fear that European powers had about having Africans or people from other parts of the empire fighting alongside white men, and seeing the vulnerability of the white race, or the barbarity of Europeans. But in much of this footage, you actually see how multiracial some of these spaces were. So that was also something that kind of really stuck out at me.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to, I'm not profoundly familiar with John's work, but what the little I know is that that's also part of his strategy in depicting, the message that he wants to depict. I think he strongly believes in the strategy of using, for lack of a better word, pastiche, where he brings seemingly discrete elements together. So in terms of the title, where does it fit? In terms of the color that is depicted, the black and white, the color, the focus on the intense red that we see. I think it's all part of his strategy. I read somewhere that he said he was influenced by Andrei Tarkovsky, I believe that's a name, and how he was really caught into his style. And for him, it is one of the key ways that he has really absorbed into his practice. And I think we see that, in the movie itself, and perhaps even in the installation, right? Where you have these three big panels comes together, you are watching seemingly discrete patterns, not patterns, but discrete elements, and it complements, again, the message, right? So that's what, if I were to be John, I think that would have been my response.
Maybe just the last thing I'll say before throwing it open was the presence of water throughout the film also, I thought, was a powerful way of reminding us that this war was taking place both on land and at sea, and that many people perished at sea or were otherwise drawn into the war at sea. And one of the figures that I've traced in some of my own work, and it just sort of shows you the kinds of ironies that are at play, is a young man named Alfred Anand from the Gold Coast who happened to be on a German merchant ship at the outbreak of World War I, was caught, was taken possession of from this German ship, didn't have any papers to show that he was a quote-unquote British subject, and was interned as an enemy alien in Britain during the war, and then was expelled to Germany, and ended up there for a very long time, married a German Jewish woman. As Hitler came to power, they were eventually sent back to the Gold Coast, and he ended up enlisting for the British at World War II, was on one of the first transatlantic convoys, and ended up dying as a result of that British convoy being torpedoed by the Germans. So these kinds of, ongoing histories, when you get down to the kind of personal level and you begin to see the ways in which these wars, shaped people's lives, is quite powerful. And I think that one of the things that I really appreciated about the film was the invitation to imagine what that experience was like for each of the people that we see. When we encounter so many faces and of people who experienced the war, and to just stop for a second and say, what did they experience? What was that like for them? I think is really powerful. So unless you wanted to say anything else, we could open it up.
Yeah, of course, as a Ghanaian and a Khan, I am interested in, the issue of indirectness and oblique communication. And in John's work, I think this comes out. So if we were to be here, I wanted to know if this strategy of using indirectness, right, in this particular film was part of, his Ghanaian heritage. Of course, we know that being indirect in communication is not, the preserve of Ghanaians who are Khans, right? So if John were to be here, I would have asked him that question. So anyways, John, if you're watching, please answer me later. So, yeah.
So, Jean, yeah. And then Salah. And Dede.
Oh, and then John.
And Robert.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Robert.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few things. I was so moved by the installation. Again, COVID has messed up my ability to understand time, even though I'm a historian. But I was reminded the film was made in 2018, and how much we were inundated between 2014 and 2018 with, films and commemorations of the Great War. And so I was, if he were here, I would ask him how much the way he approached this film was about all that had been sort of produced in that centennial celebrations or markings. And so that's one thing, that 2018 anniversary, and sort of speaking back to the ways in which that anniversary was being sort of commemorated across the globe, and the way he brings African soldiers to the center of that story in a way in which they hadn't been. I was particularly struck about the way he manipulated color and speed. I think I would call it speed. So I've watched these black and white kind of I've looked at the photos and the news clips, ever since I was an undergraduate. And you sort of get just sort of numb to them and to what you're actually watching. Because the soldiers are marching, they're in black and white, and they're also marching very fast, and it almost seems like a cartoon. And so there's a way in which you don't feel anything. It's just, oh, they're marching quickly in black and white. So the way he then inserts across these three screens vivid color. This is, and I'd also be interested in how it was shot and with what, to get that kind of super vivid color, which contrasts so sharply with the black and white, so that you can't actually then look at the black and white and see it the same way. Because you're looking at close-ups, and they're generally either not moving, or they're moving very slowly. And so it makes you look back at the black and white news clippings, particularly where they're in motion in a completely different way. At least it did me. So that was striking and stunning. What I also didn't know, and I found out subsequently, and maybe everybody in the room knows this, but I didn't, was that it was shot here, right? And so the ending shots where it's almost like a museum, the various bits of material culture that are in the room was shot in the room that we were watching it, which is another reason why you shouldn't have watched it on TV. So we become sort of a part of the set of the filming, but as viewers at the end. So I just thought it was quite amazing. So thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to see that film. I think it was the single most striking thing, and I think the most memorable thing probably I've ever seen. I'll never forget what I saw, and I'm happy I saw it 1.5 times, because in the evening of the night before. And I've loved all the comments I've heard from all of you. It'd be really interesting to be able to hear from John. Maybe he might be like Anachwe and want us to interpret it our own way. But all the things you've all picked up on struck me too. On the issue of the identity of the soldiers, Carina, it's interesting what you're saying about that time in London in the UK, when black was interpreted as, had a much broader definition. I remember once I went to a book review called Black Women's something at the Africa Center, and there was an Irish woman and a Chinese woman who explained why they felt black too, because they felt as outsiders. Huh? But in this particular film, it doesn't say black soldier, it says African soldier. And I thought there were some clues. I was discussing, Hakim was next to me and Ruby, and we were trying to figure out the nationalities of those three men. And we know there were some clues from the flags at the end. But I felt that one represented Anglophone or West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, whatever. One represented, the one in the fez hat, maybe the Sahel or North Africa. The one in the turban I wouldn't have said was Indian, because I would have thought East Africa. There were dhows, some of the imagery contained dhows and things. But I thought the importance of showing that there were a lot of Indians who were brought to the war was in showing that it was a world war. It wasn't just Africans, people from all over the world. But I did feel that the identity of the three soldiers were different parts, represented different parts of Africa, and maybe even we thought the different colonial powers.
Yeah, absolutely, and that could be the case. I wanted to say I'm aware that the title's African Soldier. I was precisely because there were so many different people. It appeared that there were so many different people, not just from India, because, right, you could theoretically say, okay, if they're Indian, they could be from, let's say, East Africa. But it seemed to me that
Asia.
there was, and in reading about the film, it's clear that that was intentional to give, to bring those soldiers into view as well, who were from elsewhere in the empire. My observation or question was about the spirit behind intentionally naming it African Soldier when it's clear that not all of the soldiers were from Africa. And that's what made me think about John's, his place in London at that time, and wondering if that spirit of a more encompassing vision of what it meant to be black was translated into titling it African Soldier. Was just a thought. Yeah.
No. Be nice to hear from him.
Yes,
what
it
he
would be so
intended.
nice.
Can't wait to hear.
I cannot claim to be in the place or a replacement of John, but I'm trying just to help a little bit as, in a way, to think about him in the context of his own production, but then to reflect on the film as well. John was part of the Black Art movement that is, of course, started in the United States, but then in the 80s, it has its own life in the UK. So at that time, of course, it was a broad movement that include all, I mean, even people from Philippines and others, and of John's generation now, people like David Madala and others, for example, emerge. Rashid Arain, Sertex, Black Phoenix. So he was part of that context, and he's one of the founders, actually, the founder of the Black Audio Film Collective, which actually emerged since then and produced so many other, artists who worked on, became part of the British Black scene. But believe it or not, like many other in the Black British scene, they have been active producing, but like the story in the United States or globally, they were not really recognized. But I'm so glad that John now really emerged as one of the strongest voices out of in contemporary art overall, and especially in the British scene. But what is important is something that is unique in terms of his relationship with Ghana. His father was part of the cabinet of Nkrumah, and I think anybody in this room who's in Ghanaian studies would know that he was assassinated, and they have to escape to England at age 4. So it's interesting that he did only one film on Ghana, that's Testament. But then the rest of the film, you see this kind of Pan-African, global films on, 7 songs of Malcolm X, and he covered the march. He did a great film on the March of the civil rights, the one March to Washington. And then he shifted, and at that time he was in the genre of the documentary. But the move towards this kind of an installation, multimedia one, is a recent move that's actually, at least, strengthened or at least not pushed into it, but afforded through being represented in biennials and others. So that's how it carried on. It allowed him, of course, to tell multiple stories. And to answer the question in terms of Britain, it's true, as you both mentioned, especially Carina, is that the blackness at that time was defined as broader than and it's because they were all subjects of empire and happened to be there at the center of Britain, the empire itself. But what will happen if we move towards the story itself, and I think it is important to talk about the artistic side, is that from the title, of course, it has a long history. Mimesis, or Mimesis, as some people sometimes pronounce it, goes back into the earlier Greek philosophy. But here in this context, I would say, that's just my guessing, is that it allows him to tell, because it's a sort of an enactment that does not have to speak to one reality, but multiple realities. So the multimedia, the triple or trilogy in terms of 3 screens allowed him to tell the complexity of the story. And I think that's important to mention, is that why is it a mimesis in the context of an African soldier? And the presence of other, and I think that's how he contextualized it, in a sense, this is a story larger than Africa, and that it has to relate to larger stories. But of course, it's also a homage and a tribute, and that's, I think, the essence of it. And that's what I like, is that in terms of, it's not about aestheticizing a horror, but I think it's also showing the beauty of people in the context of even in the face of horror. There was the stories of leaving the families behind and so forth. And it's many times some comments about what about the women in those movies. And I think the answer is clear, is that that's war at the time is instigated by men and fought by men. It's a masculine terrain. But the women, of course, are involved. They are part of the family that's left behind that have to take care of issues within. And I think that's important to emphasize, that why women are represented in the way they're represented in the film. Not because it was a sexist or, but it has to do with what the reality is there. And that the job that they have to face is actually as complex and as equal, as forceful, like the story of going into the war and in that context. I hope I just tried to fill some of the gaps, but not to make another election.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, I feel like you should have been up here. Robert.
Thank you. I did not have a chance to see the film last night. I will see it as soon as possible now. I have a question, knowing more about the South African example with the Mendi disaster, that ship that sank off the coast of England, tragically. And I'm thinking about how this might show up in the film. So the question of remembrance and memorialization. So there were Mendi clubs that were created that would seem to be like fraternals or benefit societies connected to war veterans that continued, from my understanding, into the 1950s. And I'm curious if a similar dynamic happened with other war veterans in different parts of Africa. I'm curious too about drives to memorialization, to have monuments in recognition of those soldiers, whether there were petitions to various colonial authorities to have resolutions acknowledging the service. So I'm thinking about that beyond South Africa, where there are similar examples of this. And I'm also thinking about whether during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s and the general anti-fascist outcry, whether there were connections being made along the lines of, we fought in World War I for democracy or self-determination, what have you, and a desire to fight on behalf of Ethiopia. Whether there were connections made, quite often we go from World War I to World War II, right? But we skip over the Spanish Civil War, the Italian invasion, whether there were connections made with these World War I veterans wanting to engage either the anti-fascist campaigns of the Spanish Civil War or the invasion of Ethiopia. And then two, whether there were variations of what I know with the US, the Double V campaign, and for World War II, saying we fought in World War I, we expected certain rights, we did not get them. This time, if we fight, we will demand X, Y, Z. So without having seen the film, I don't know. I'm just curious whether that shows up in the film. And then, well, I'll stop there. I've talked enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the film itself, the way that it concludes, it seems very clear to me that the reading is that all of those promises were left unfulfilled. That this was not something that was reciprocal. I mean, there's that really, really powerful set of images of the lone soldier, looking out at this body of water in I think it's like a sparse tree. And, this is after the war is over, and he sits down on a chair. It's like you've finally come to rest after this horrific experience, and then he's shot and he just dies, and it's this like, so for me, it doesn't go, the film itself doesn't go past, doesn't look at the, engage all of those histories that you just mentioned, but I think it answers the question definitively with, in the sense of, it stoked grievances because it wasn't reciprocal, and they weren't honored for their service.
Well, thank you guys for carrying on with this conversation. And I like the absent presence of John Akomfrah as our interlocutor. So I'm speaking to to John's chair here, to John Akomfrah's chair. I just wanted to talk just for a second about the formal aspects of the film, because as someone who tries to sometimes wear a scholarly hat and sometimes wear an artistic hat, and knowing both of your work, I'm curious what you guys made of. There's no dialogue. There's a handful of words, but John is nothing if not a brilliant storyteller, and he's a to me, I see it more as a portrait. But John, he's telling a story without words, and he's telling a story that then plays with temporality, as Jean's pointing out, by moving across the screens, as well as slowing down and speeding up certain kinds of things. So I was just watching it in some ways as someone who is telling a profound story about a historical moment, and then forcing us to slow down a little bit in the way we look at things, and forcing us to watch figures move across the screens and change in sort of incremental ways, following the sort of narrative of a kind of moment of violence and this moment of kind of implosion and articulation of a colonial imperial set of projects and a kind of global war, and pulling people in multiple directions that don't fit into the ways that these things are normally narrated. But I'm wondering what you guys think of how he's telling a story without words, without sort of oral words, but the soundscape is very important. But you kind of feel like you have a sense of characters in a way that I feel like sometimes when I write a lot of words, I don't give as good an impression of. So just posing this as a question for you both as scholars, how might it affect the way that you write history, or Frimpong tells stories about cultural production or popular culture moments? And especially someone like I struggle, sometimes I feel like I talk too much. Sometimes I feel like I miss the main point, even though I've said a lot of random words. And John's this brilliant formal he's a filmmaker. He's a trained filmmaker who's creating these portraits. Every image is carefully thought out and brilliantly produced. And just every placement is just brilliant. And yet, you're not worried about the details. You're just taking it in as a set of kind of images and sounds that kind of overwhelm you and move through time. So just as scholars, does it affect the way that you might think about your own production?
I was
Should I
going
go?
right there.
Should I go? Okay. So Jesse, for me, what I've learned about John is the fact that he's very interested in bringing into conversations discrete elements that seem to be on the surface, have no connection with one another. And I think that's what is captured in the film. And in terms of, perhaps how I might, how's it called? I might utilize this feature of bringing in seemingly disparate things into my work. Perhaps it has started, and that's a plug-in, a shameless plug-in. It has really started in trying to have a center, right, that focuses on popular culture. People, scholars that are in the classroom and in the library are not supposed to be, interested in setting up, perhaps such centers that deals with people on the street, artists, roadside artists, etc. So perhaps I have started it, but with your question, it has brought into relief what I am doing now without even perhaps thinking about it, so.
I'll just be really brief to say literally until you pointed out that there was no dialogue, it never occurred to me. That may say more about the voices in my head than anything else, but and I think it probably says a lot about who I am as a historian. I have dialogue that goes in my head all of the time. I'm always, so it's really fascinating. I would have to rethink the film, realizing that I invented an entire dialogue to narrate it that wasn't John's, so.
And just go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, in my previous life, I wrote papers. I've written 2 papers on silence, right? So I'm within that terrain already, I guess, so.
So I think we just have about 8 minutes left.
Yes.
And so we want to take maybe 3 questions.
Mine is really an observation about history rather than filmmaking, because and about the difficulty of presenting history maybe in film, because I think one of the things that made me reflect on is the extent to which the First World War is actually an African war in many ways. Carina mentioned the first shot was fired in Togo. I think the last shot was also fired in Africa. It's difficult to know when the war actually ended, but I think the last shot was fired in Tanganyika in East Africa. And the war was very much about Africa and the redivision of Africa. And we sometimes forget maybe that's what occurred at the end of the war. And the war itself nearly started in Africa, because there's a very good chance that the war might have started in Morocco. So in all senses, it was very African. And if we look back into the history of Pan-Africanism to make that link, we'll see that analysis presented by W.B. Du Bois in one of his most famous articles, The African Roots of War. So I think that it's a chance for us to kind of reflect and remember that character of the war. The second thing is about participation in the war, and I think I'm right in saying that millions of Africans participated in the war, not just those who fought or those who were. Many Africans, in fact, weren't allowed to fight, weren't allowed to carry guns because of particularly in the British Army, because of the racism that existed at that time. But amongst those millions of participants, there were also many women, and it's important not to neglect those. And I think the latest research shows that women were sometimes combatants and spies and all kinds of things, and participated in the war. And then the third thing, very, very briefly, is the importance of, there are many things, I'm going to limit it to three. The other thing is that the opposition to the war in Africa, the many rebellions that took place during the war, the most famous of which would be probably John Chilembwe's rebellion in what was then Nyasaland, that Africans refused to accept that they were being plunged into a war that was being conducted by the big imperialist power. So I think it's quite an important history to reflect on, and not in any way think it's kind of peripheral to Africa and its history.
Absolutely. There's a great book by Michelle Moyd on the Askaris in German East Africa, and she deals with this question beautifully about the role of women in that. Highly recommended. Holiday?
Oh, sorry. I wanted to pick up on what you were both just talking about with women, and also think with Salah in terms of what he was saying. The first time that I saw this piece was at the Imperial War Museum in 2018, and I was very disturbed by the portrayal of women at that point. But I also think that my relationship to the work was shaped by the experience of seeing it within that context, and what it meant to approach that as part of a museum about war, and really being surrounded by the apparatus of war and looking for something different from it within that context. Whereas here within Sharjah, I do think that it actually functions differently, although again, I was very struck by the masculine and masculinist aesthetic of Gerald's photography, and of the very masculine imagery of the 1970s, and the masculine implications of that imagery. And in looking at John's work after visiting that exhibition, what also struck me was an aesthetics that was being mobilized, that was, on the one hand, using tropes that are recognizable, of linking the woman to home and culture, and but also thinking about the trope. It made me think of the way that Fedayeen have been shown, with the power and pride of the men with upturned rifles at different times, but that I think my my thoughts about the film have shifted in being able to see it here within Sharjah, but I do think that there is space to reflect on the masculine aesthetics that are being mobilized.
Hi. On 28th February, actually, a feature-length animation film was released in Ghana on the veterans that were at the World War as well, and the ones who came back and demanded their rights and got gunned down. So it's interesting, because when I started watching the film, I was like, wow, this was made in 2018. And the animation film has just been released, so it's as if it's a continuum, of the conversation. And also on what you said, that the last beat of the film, the last scene where they're all gunned down, metaphorically showing the many broken promises. So I found that really quite compelling. But also, I think that in whatever form, this film immortalizes all these 6 million, soldiers that have never really been remembered, or like you keep saying, I made a footnote of, and moves also away from the single story of the World War and people who fought in it and what happened. But the visual metaphors were really very compelling. And the use of sound design, I think one of the things that really carried the film, beyond the archival footage and all the color, I think one thing that moved us without us realizing that there was no dialogue, there was no narration, was the extensive use and intentional use of sound design, where to the extent that for an installation like this or a documentary film where he's practicing the off-screen technique and nobody's bothered because we feel like we are in the space. That's how I felt, that you were carried along because of the way he plays with sound at different moments. And sometimes the fact that he's using sound that is probably not related to certain pictures, but again, still work, I think is very, very commendable. And also the production design, how each of the soldiers were dressed and how symbolic they were, and how visual metaphors again plays out, where by the way they're dressed, you can sort of deduce which colony they were probably coming from, or which empire they belonged to, or which army they represented. And I commend the filmmaker for putting all that much thoughts and intentionally putting all these images together so that, eventually, even though it's a bit unconventional, it's a very useful material that is not only meant for the museum or film festivals, but for educational purposes as well. Very, very good historical material. Thanks to John.
Thank you. All right, well, I think this may be the first time that we're gonna succeed in ending a session on time. So well done, everybody. Thank you.